Thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie.
Going to the NDP, MP Blaikie, and you'll be our final questioner.
Thank you very much.
Chiru.
I think for Canadians that get the lion's share of their knowledge about federal government policy from question period might be thinking that the carbon tax is a large source of net revenue for the government. I'm just wondering, what is the net revenue to the federal government from the carbon tax?
Well, the carbon tax has been designed such as the vast majority of the proceeds is returned to individuals and households. So the net revenue for the government should be negligible, especially when considering the admin costs. So the net proceeds for the government of the carbon tax is not exactly zero, but close to zero.
Okay,
so,
but it's not a real revenue source. It wouldn't appear in a budget table or anything like that.
For government operations of over $400 billion, it is negligible once taken into account the proceeds returned to individuals.
Okay.
As we have said in many reports.
Okay. So the money that's collected gets returned to Canadian individuals. It doesn't get. Does any of it get returned to Canadian businesses?
To my knowledge, it doesn't. There might be some very specific aspects, but the bulk of the proceeds gets returned to individuals, to households.
Okay. And we've heard a lot of controversy around the question of whether Canadian households receive more back from the tax that they pay than they pay the tax. But what I'm hearing is that actually the entire amount that individuals pay that's designated as a carbon tax, and then the entire amount that businesses pay that's designated as a carbon tax is returned to Canadian individuals. Is there a household income level under which we could say with confidence people are receiving more than they're paying, or a break-even point?
So that's a question to which the answer varies by province, because it depends on consumption patterns, on how the electricity that households consume, how it's generated. Is it generated from fossil fuels or not? But generally speaking, if we look only at the carbon tax that households pay and the rebate that they get, the majority, I'd say about 80%, get more in rebates than what they pay. The top quintile, so the top 20% of household in terms of income, generally pay more than what they get in rebates if we only look at the carbon tax they pay versus what they receive. But it varies, of course, depending on individual consumption patterns. If you drive a big VR and you heat your home with oil or natural gas, you will obviously pay more than you receive in carbon taxes. The controversy has arisen because of the inclusion of the economic impacts of a carbon tax. It's true that any tax has implications and generates some friction in the economy, and the carbon tax is no different. So introducing a carbon tax has impacts on specific sectors, and the more fossil fuel intensive these sectors are, the more impacts are likely to be felt on these sectors. So when including the economic impacts, we find that most households will see a small loss, depending on the magnitude varies, but a loss in taking into account the loss of economic output, investment income, employment income, and the difference between what they pay and the rebate they receive. So it's taking into account all the impacts of a carbon tax on the economy.
Is that a forecasting as well?
Yes.
Okay. And so does that forecasting include likely emission reductions from investments that government and people in the private sector are making in order to reduce their emissions already? Or is that not part of the assumption base that generates those forecasts?
So that includes the behavioral change that will be induced by the carbon tax and its increase, but it does not include the so-called benefits of carbon emissions reductions, because these are very difficult. It's very difficult to quantify in dollar terms the benefits of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. If there was a way to quantify these benefits between now and 2030 of reducing carbon emissions, we'd be happy to consider and include them. But the dollar benefits of transitioning to a greener economy between now and 2030 are very, very difficult to assess.
Okay. So in the economic analysis that says Canadians are breaking even or suffering a small loss, there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made about behavioral change. And there hasn't been an attempt, because there's too much uncertainty and there isn't an adequate model to measure the financial benefit of emissions reductions. But on what we can measure very clearly, which is money paid under the auspices of the carbon tax and the money that's refunded to individuals, 80% of Canadians are are breaking even or receiving more back than they pay in the carbon tax. And of the 20% that are likely to be paying more in tax than they're receiving back, they're likely to be in the top quintile of Canadian earners. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, and that's a fair depiction of the results of our multiple reports on that issue over the last few years.
Thank you for that. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
the clarity, because I think it's
Thank you.
become quite muddled in parliamentary debate recently.